Episodes of the PEP Talk podcast are usually recorded via Zoom with participants scattered around the world, but not this time. This is the second of a special two-part episode of PEP Talk recorded live in London, England. We're talking about a variety of different question topics.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Going back to when you were devising the model that we now call Participatory Economy model, I'm reminded of the famous quote by, I think it was Keynes, who said the quote something like, when we it basically boils down to, we hate capitalism, but when we're trying to think of a different model, we're just staring at a wall, we're befuddled. Right? You've quoted the quote, I don't have it at my tip of my tongue at the moment. But that kind of leads me to my question, is that despite the fact that when you were befuddled, you and Michael Albert and now a number of others have taken on the challenge about that, did you find that this challenge was particularly hard when you took it on? I mean, it seems like it's like you're trying to challenge one of the major names in economic history regarding a big task. It's like, we're going to create something that even Keynes was befuddled by, and you pretty much did it.
Oh,
was it hard?
I never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
I always thought of it as, wow, here is the 20th century's greatest economist.
Mm-hmm. Not Milton Friedman?
Yes. Certainly not Milton Friedman.
Okay.
And it's interesting because in economics, in PhD programs in economics in the United States, in 9 out of 10 of them, we're training PhDs in economics who really know nothing about Keynes. And
that's funny.
If Keynes is the greatest economist of the 20th century, which I believe he was, and if the people we're training, when you ask them about Keynes, all they can tell you, and I've had this happen to me, somebody who's a newly minted PhD in economics in the United States, and if you get into a conversation with Keynes about Keynes with him, and it'll be a him, not a she. Say, Keynes, yeah, but he was proved to be wrong, right?
Right.
That's literally the reaction, which of course says, oh, but Milton Friedman taught us that Keynes was wrong. Well, Keynes wasn't wrong. But here we have, for me, the greatest economist of the 20th century, who is giving incredibly useful advice to capitalism and how to manage it far more better to prevent it from the kind of catastrophes that were brought on by the Great Depression. And he's reflecting and he's saying, wow, this system is really ugly and it's really not very good. But we, and it's kind of like the royal we, Lord, he is a Lord Keynes.
Yep.
When we think about an alternative, we find ourselves perplexed. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, I read that as an open invitation to, I, Lord Keynes, I've been thinking about all these things, and the system that I'm trying to save from killing itself isn't very attractive. But when I think about it, is there an alternative system? I mean, I'm still perplexed. So our response to that was, well, let's write Lord Keynes about, well, maybe this is the answer to what you have not thought very much about and find yourself rather perplexed about.
Right.
I mean, I'd love to believe that if he came back to life and we showed him everything we've done on a participatory economy, he would just say, I was perplexed, but now here it is. Thank you very much.
Was it hard?
I'm sure he wouldn't.
But it sounds like it wasn't that hard, especially the way you did it, which is kind of like also adding variance from other models I've heard of. No one is actually taking out like the setup, like they just want to try to invent a model out of what they think might be good, but not like the systematic approach that you and others took. Like first write out the goals and then try to create institutions that you think would achieve those goals.
And when you create one, look and see is it likely to achieve that goal? If it's not, in what way wouldn't it be? And then maybe either you have to throw that institution out and try another one, or you have to seriously tinker with that institution if it might not be doing a very good job of achieving a particular goal.
Right.
Yeah, that was our methodology, and quite frankly, I think I can say pretty confidently that's not the way that almost anybody else who's created, a model alternative to capitalism has gone about it.
And that's also...
And I feel increasingly happy about doing it that way. I think that is the right way to do it.
Part of me feels like that's been a great strength regarding this model, is that it's actually trying to take an almost mathematical approach. First, you define your axioms, as it were, and then building off of that. And that, I think, is probably one reason why, at least in my mind, it's been such a strong model as is, and only getting stronger over time.
I mean, one of the disadvantages of it is if you're very careful about defining your goals, you can lose supporters. Because, well, think about it. Out there on the left, suppose you say our goal is we want economic democracy. Mm-hmm. Who is going to object? So you've got...
No one.
That's right. You've got 100
Want to be tyrants? I don't know.
That's right. And if you say, well, our goal is we want to achieve economic justice, who's going to object?
Right.
But the problem is that, well, what do you mean exactly by economic democracy? And when you dig into that, then you are going to find yourself, not everybody agrees with that more careful explanation of what it is that economic democracy, as you mean economic democracy, you're going to, and certainly, I mean, even in the area of economic democracy, when we define that in more carefully as decision-making input in proportion to the degree that you're affected, and people come to the conclusion, that doesn't mean one person, one vote on every economic decision. Mm-hmm. Well, then all of a sudden you have controversy.
Right.
Well, in terms of economic justice, nothing has consumed the left for 200 years more than arguments and disagreements and not everybody seeing exactly eye to eye on, well, what exactly is economic? Is this what's fair and what's not fair in terms of distributing the benefits and burdens of economic activity. So once you make clear, well, this is what we mean by economic justice, well, then there's going to be people, and frankly, sometimes that's the difference between somebody who finds a market socialist model. There'll be people who find the market socialist model more attractive to them because it actually delivers on a different version of what it is that economic justice is. Yeah. So there is, I think methodologically, anybody thinking about it methodologically would say that is the right way to go. But in terms of whether you shed people who agree with you relatively quickly in the discussion, I can promise you it does.
Going back to one point regarding the proverbial newly minted PhD in economics, and the fact that they would be probably all but ignorant about Keynes in all likelihood. It would read to me that, and you probably agree with this, that and it's probably been the case almost since the model was first published, the model of participatory economy, that the economics field has maybe like among activists has certainly gotten some attention, and maybe some, as they're called, heterodox economists have gotten attention. But the major and probably majority of the field has basically all but ignored it and would be ignorant if you were ever asked it. Has there been any movement within the mainstream regarding this model, even if it's just to belittle it? Or have they just ignored it? Has that changed at all in the last 30 years? What's your take on that?
No, I can't think of anybody in the mainstream of the profession certainly there's nobody in the mainstream of the profession who's come out and say, I really like this.
Right.
I work with people on other issues in economics. And so there are mainstream economists that I work with in other areas. And what they say to me is, Robin, I'm just not interested.
Yeah.
mean, some of those people are open-minded enough to say, I don't know whether those ideas that you're putting out in that regard, I don't know what I would think of them. I just don't think anything other than capitalism is remotely possible. And so I just am not that interested in it. So it's not always a refutation like, oh my gosh, I think it's not necessarily a rejection of the model if you could actually implement it, and put it in practice. Mm-hmm. It's a rejection on the practical grounds that I just don't think that's ever going to happen in a remotely reasonable time period, and I have no interest.
Right. Now, suppose that were to ever change. And
Robert Reich would be an example.
Okay, sure.
So Robert Reich is a progressive and liberal economist.
And former, he was in the Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration.
Yes, he was.
Makes a lot of videos these days.
Right, so he was an early Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration. He was probably his most progressive cabinet member. Mm-hmm. And he left relatively early when he realized the Clinton administration was not going to be very pro-labor. I mean, that's the simple of it.
Yeah.
But he has since then, people are familiar with his writings and his works. Mm-hmm. And he comments on economic issues,
all the time.
and makes, and his reaction to this is, I don't know whether I would agree with what you've said in terms of an alternative, but it's not on my agenda.
If this were to ever come to fruition, a model or maybe even like something that would cause the field to suddenly have to sit up and take notice, they'll be caught really flat-footed. So if there were ever, some revolution in some country and they decide we're going to implement these ideas tomorrow and we're going to try to go as the state of the art as much as we can, and they implement it and it works, right? And suddenly everyone's freaked out about it and then you have to crush it in some way. But then the economists are like, what do you think? And they're just like, I don't know, because they never thought about these things.
Okay, I have a closer personal friend who's sort of a little similar to Robert Reich.
Okay.
His name is Mark Weisbrod.
Yes.
Mark Weisbrod he and Dean Baker were the co-directors of an economic think tank or institute in Washington, D.C. called CEPR, Center for Economic Policy Research. Mm. And they do fabulous work. And Mark and I have been friends for a long, long time. Now, Mark actually had very good working relations with people in the government in Venezuela and even better working relations with people in the government of Ecuador, when Ecuador had a very progressive government. Mm. And so he actually he's been called in, to give advice, usually about balance of payment crises. And so I have a somewhat different interaction with Mark than I've had then. And I don't have any personal interaction to speak of with Robert Reich. But Mark and I talk all the time. And my belief, and when I talk to him about this, he says, okay, that's your thing. I don't really do that. And I'm listening to you. There's other things that I do well and I'm busy doing. But I don't think it's impossible that if in Latin America in particular, a left movement comes to power, they will already have been used to, working and consulting with Mark Weisbrod. And Mark would recommend me as somebody they should talk to about these issues.
Cool.
And that would be good.
Yeah.
I want to mention one other person nobody's heard of. If you're not a Latin Americanist, you don't know who Pepe Mujica is. Pepe Mujica was a leader of the Tupac Amaru guerrilla movement in Uruguay in the 1960s.
Tupac Amaru, though, I thought was Peruvian.
Wait a minute. Tupac Amaru it's a very similar name.
Okay. But we're talking Uruguay, not Peru.
We're talking Uruguay.
Right.
And,
but Pepe Mujica.
So, and this was a, leftist guerrilla movement, as a leftist urban guerrilla movement in Uruguay, fighting and arguing for, socialism, anti-U.S. imperialism, very favorable. I mean, we're talking 1968, 69. So they, in some sense, were Guevarists. I mean, Che Guevara was killed in Bolivia, I think, in 67, 68.
Yeah, that's right.
So they were of that era, and he was a major leader, and he was captured and imprisoned for, I think, probably 20 years. Well, interestingly enough, he eventually was elected. In the 1990s and 20s, he was elected president of Uruguay twice. And what he has said is, I mean, he's basically renounced the tactics and the strategy of urban guerrilla warfare, but hasn't really changed in his ideas about what would be a desirable economy and a desirable society. And one of the endorsements that I am most proud of for any of my books is from Pepe Mujica. And what he literally said in his endorsement was, it's very clear that we leftists need to dramatically rethink and have a dramatic rethinking of our ideas of, if we ever have the chance, how will we go about trying to create socialism? And he was positively enough disposed toward our ideas. And this is the kind of book that we need to be reading when we do this thinking, and we must do this thinking. And in some ways, that's the way I see this. More and more of us are thinking harder, thinking better, improving the quality of what it is that we've pre-thought about the consequences of doing this rather than that. Made the proposals and the arguments for it as increasingly, I think, in a coherent and compelling way. And that provides an intellectual body of thought to people who, whenever you get the chance to do something like this, you're under time pressure.
Yeah.
You don't have the chance to then sit down and spend 30 years thinking about what you're going to replace capitalism with.
Yeah.
So
answers fast.
So I do see that as that should be our goal.
Okay.
To play that kind of role in a world that I hope will evolve, where there are more and more opportunities.
I have a couple more questions. One, and this is kind of like tying a number of threads here. I think you're now retired from economics work. Okay. And at the same time, you've also been at invariance with the mainstream of your profession in the field of economics, to put it mildly. It seems like that's rather, well, to be blunt, noble of you to also put it bluntly, kind of sacrifice your career for these goals and ideas. Do you have any regrets about not trying to go more into the mainstream, or what are your thoughts on the reflection of a career now? Like, how long? It's like 40 years now. How long were you teaching economics?
So I started teaching full time in 1976 at the University of Maryland.
Okay, so
it's been since 1976.
And you stopped this year?
I haven't been full time. I mean, I taught full time up until about 3 years ago.
Okay.
And then I've taught a couple of visiting professorships since then.
So we'll call that 43 years, we'll say.
Yeah.
Okay, that's quite a long career. And that's also quite a long time to spend on these, admittedly, out of the mainstream ideas. But nonetheless, support them, nurture them, refine them, improve them, advocate for them. And I think there's been some progress on that score in all that time. But at the same time, you've also, to be blunt, you could have made a lot more money in doing this kind of work.
I'm not sure I could have.
Okay, maybe not. Then I don't know. But
I'm not a very
my read about it is you could have made more if you were sticking more in the mainstream. So that's also kind of noble of you to, sacrifice income on that score. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you think? What's the story there? If you don't mind sharing.
I don't think that really that's not really the way it ever was.
Okay.
I actually felt very fortunate that I could make, a decent upper middle class salary as a full-time economics professor. Because I have 6 children and grandchildren, and I always felt like, well, this is really fortunate that I actually get paid, a middle class salary in America to largely do what I really want to do, which is do the kind of research I want to do about economic issues, including, developing an alternative to capitalism. Mm-hmm. And, if the majority of the profession in the United States isn't interested in that, well, I've been fortunate enough there are journals that you can publish in.
Yeah.
No, it's absolutely true that none of the kind of economics that I think is useful, most of the economic journals, particularly in the United States, would never even consider an article that you submit to them.
Right.
But there are journals that, that will consider them. And so, I feel thankful and grateful for that personally, as well as I'm awfully glad they're out there, in terms of us thinking, everybody trying to think things through more clearly. For me, it's always been sort of a tug of war between family responsibilities and teaching and research and political activism. Well, when you add all that together, that's more than 24 hours in a day. So you're never doing as much of any of it as you would like to do. But retirement helps. That cuts out, a bunch of time that has to be spent on teaching and grading. And one of the things I discovered when I was no longer a full-time department tenured member of the faculty was that I didn't have to go to department meetings. And since my views were a minority and it was a very frustrating experience, I discovered when I started teaching as a visiting professor at various places out in Oregon for the past 15 years, oh, wow, you don't have to go to faculty meetings, which freed up a lot of time. And that's a plus.
Cool. I guess we'll have to end it here then. This has been PEP Talk, the Participatory Economy Podcast, the podcast where we talk about the alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. To learn more, visit the website of the Participatory Economy Project at participatory.economy.org. There you can not only find past episodes of our podcast PEP Talk, but also join in with an online forum where you can discuss these and many other issues related to a participatory economy, and also sign up for a regular monthly newsletter that we distribute via email online. For Robin, this is Mitchell, coming to you from London. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangement.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work, nested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory.economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.